I would like to begin by sharing with you a brief reading, which is an edited version of what Robin Wall Kimmerer referred to as the Thanksgiving dress in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. So I've renamed it a little bit, and I call it The Words Before Other Words, in honoring of the natural world. Today we have gathered, and as we look upon the faces around us, we see the cycles of life continue. We have been given the duty to live in balance and harmony with each other and with all living things. So now let us bring our minds together as one as we give greetings and thanks to each other as people. We are thankful to our Mother Earth, for she gives us everything that we need for life. We give thanks to all the waters of the world for quenching our thirst, for providing strength and nurturing life for all beings. We turn our thoughts to the fish in the water. They were instructed to cleanse and purify the water. Now we turn towards the vast fields of plant life. As far as the eye can see, the plants grow, working many wonders. When we look about us, we see the berries are still here, providing us with delicious foods. The leader of the berries is a strawberry, the first to ripen in the spring. With one mind, we honor and thank all the food plants we harvest from the garden, especially the three sisters who feed the people with such abundance. Now we turn to the medicine herbs of the world. From the beginning, they were instructed to take away sickness. We send thanksgiving, love, and respect to the medicine plants and the keepers of the medicine. Standing around us, we see all the trees. The earth has many families of trees, who each have their own instructions and uses. We gather our minds together to send greetings and thanks to all the beautiful animal life of the world who walk about with us. They have many things to teach us as people. We put our minds together as one and thank all the birds who move and fly about over our heads. The Creator gave them the gift of beautiful songs. Each morning, they greet the day, and with their songs, reminding us to enjoy and appreciate life. We are all thankful for the powers we know as the four winds. We hear their voices in the moving air as they refresh us and purify the air we breathe. They help to bring the change of seasons. Now we turn to where our grandfathers, the thunder beings, live. With lightning and thundering voices, they bring with them the water that renews life. We send greetings and thanks to our eldest brother, the sun. Each day without fail, he travels the sky from east to west, bringing the light of a new day. We put our minds together and give thanks to our oldest grandmother, the moon, who lights the nighttime sky. She is the leader of women all over the world and governs the movement of the ocean tides. We give thanks to the stars who are spread across the sky like jewelry. When we travel at night, they guide us home. We greet and thank the enlightened teachers who have come to help throughout the ages. They remind us of the day we were instructed to live as people. We now turn our thoughts to the Creator, a great mystery, a great spirit, and send greetings and thanks for all the gifts of creation. Everything we need to live a good life is here on our Mother Earth. We have now arrived at a place where we end our words before other words. Of all the things we have named, it is not our intention to leave anything out. If something was forgotten, we leave it to each individual to send such greetings and thanks in their own way. And now our minds are one. Thank you for indulging me. I first must acknowledge the lands on which I now stand are the unceded traditional homelands of the Sikanese people of the Unalastico clan, and I honor the Sikanese Lenape, past, present, and future. On behalf of the Lenape Indian tribe of Delaware, I say Wanishi, thank you, to Montgomery County's Donna Richmond and staff for the invitation and opportunity to celebrate Native American Heritage Month and share some Lenape history and worldview. As was mentioned, I am Dennis White Otter Coker, Principal Chief of the Lenape Indian Tribe of Delaware. I am the son of Anna Loatman Coker and Carlton Coker. It is very typical that we introduce our family connection so that our listeners would know from which families we represent. And I say at this time that all of the ancestors that I have on both sides of my family were born in the town of Cheswold, here in Kent County, Delaware, as far back as I can go in the historical record, which is 1765. So my tribal affiliation is Sicanese Lenape. I do not use the word indigenous. I prefer being referred to as Lenape or native. And of course, we are located here in our traditional homeland of north central Kent County, Delaware. So a brief history of the Lenape. When Henry Hudson turned into the Delaware Bay in 1608, it was the Sicanese Lenape were the first people that he encountered. In the century between 1600 and 1700, we had a 90% population decline. Smallpox and measles were the culprits, and that equaled a societal collapse. Starting in 1700, tribes began leaving the area, and the main body of Delaware were already west of the Susquehanna and in eastern Ohio by 1740. We began a conversion to Christianity, those that stayed behind, and that is the only thing that allowed us to remain in our homeland. There's an old saying that a praying Indian is a safe Indian, only as long as those prayers were Christian prayers. Our population began stabilizing during that century. Farming continued to be a way of life for us. And we also continued to work on the water at that time as fishermen, for the most part. So as we enter into the 19th century, that period between 1800 and 1900, we did a search of the census records. And in 1800, we identified 55 households of our people that were living between Duck Creek 100 and Mispillion 100, which in Kent County is between Smyrna and Milford. And when we look at those households, there were between 8 and 12, we'll say 10 people per household. So we have about 5,500 people, or 550 people living here in Kent County in 1800, which pretty much bears out the math of the pre-contact population of around 5,000 here. And then that 90% population decline during the 17th century. So we find ourselves at 550 people at 1800. And it's pretty interesting that when we look at the 1810 census, all of those families disappear. They're nowhere to be found in the census. So, which was very curious. So we looked at the tax records of that same period, and we see all of these families are still present and accounted for. So the question emerges, why weren't they counted in the census? Well, the only people that are not counted in the censuses of that era were Indians not taxed. So it was obviously a determination by the census enumerators, which were actually federal marshals at the time, that these people were Indians and they were not to be counted. So in essence, that was our very first federal recognition, because those federal marshals collaborating with the local officials made that determination. So, we actually had federal recognition 75 years before the current federal recognition process began. In the 1860s, churches became the center of our life and provided a continuity of governance. And in 1880, our schools began. We actually had two schools that were functioning, and they were Indian schools in my community. We had one at an area called Fort Branch, one in the town of Cheswold, and they no longer exist to this day. Both succumbed to arson fires, so we do not have those structures. But in 1865, we actually had a separate identity emerge. As a result of a court case that took place in Sussex County, Delaware, the Levi Sockham trial, there was a Levi Sockham had been arrested for selling powder and shot to a prohibited class of people, which were actually his own people. But during that trial, a witness came forth to explain these different people in Sussex County, and that witness talked about a red-haired Irish woman who went to the Lewis slave block and bought a Moorish prince. Then she took him home, and he became her personal servant. And the next thing you know, they had children. And those children, being mixed race, were not accepted by the white population. They weren't accepted by the black population. So they ended up marrying into the Indians. So they would have us believe that this whole group of people spawned from one union, which is very far from the truth. This separate identity that I was talking about, the judge, the presiding judge at that trial, Judge Fisher, and when he wrote his memoirs in 1865, actually labeled these people Moors, Moors, which is very far from the truth. There is no evidence to suggest that we are of Moorish descent. But that term Moor was embraced by our community because it was less offensive than everything else that we had been called up to that point. We were mulattoes in the record, we were high yellers, we were Indian looking. So that term Moor at least provided us with a separate identity, which was of supreme importance to us. I even had on my very first driver's license in 1968, there was a block that was had race, and in my block there was an M. And when I turned over the driver's license, the legend on the black informed me that that M stood for Moor. So, up into, that period in the late 1960s, we were still being referred to as Moors. On the 72 license that I got 4 years later, I had an O in my box, and that O stood for other. So I became an other for a little while. And then in 76, the next 4-year cycle, they had removed race from the license entirely. So I didn't know what I was at that point. So, we've gone through a little bit of the history of my Lenape community, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the present. Um, which is my lived experience of being raised in a community of very like individuals. We had the census designation that was referred to a little bit earlier. We had 700 people self-identify in a census district that we had created in 2009 as Lenape. So that's quite a sizable community. And I live in that community, have lived in that community all my life. And, and I am blood related to 90% of those people through intermarriage. Our community is what's referred to as an endogamous community, where we had married within and pretty exclusively for the most part. I mean, there are those that married out, but when they did so, they typically left the community for one reason or another. We have a sister community in New Jersey, in Cumberland County, New Jersey. They refer to themselves as the Nanticoke Lenai Lenape. And we are intermarried pretty much by marriage with those people as well as the Nanticoke Indian tribe in Sussex County, Delaware. So between those three communities, which is where we were kind of directed to look for a spouse. Those relationships were pretty much managed by the grandmothers. You'd be at a social function and you'd be showing interest in an individual, and your grandmother may call you off to the side and say, you need that one there is a little bit too close, but that one over there, you you may look over there a little bit, So, our families were very critical in those upbringings, and it's very true for Indian people. It takes a community to raise a child. And in my early life, I did attend the Cheswold School, Indian school, for 1 week. The process back when I was entering school in 1958 was that you would attend the last week of school of the prior year before you would typically start in September. So I have an older brother who was 1 year older than me. So I went to school with him for a week. And unfortunately, he got held back in his first grade. He had his tonsils out in the spring of that year, and I think he milked it just a little bit too long and ate too much ice cream, but he missed too many days. And so my mother was so infuriated when he got held back, because the teacher that held him back was actually her sister-in-law. And so over that summer, she changed her religion from Methodist to Catholicism, and I was enrolled in the local parochial school come that next September, which I spent the next 12 years of my life attending that school. The Creator, he works in strange ways. I got an excellent education in that 12 years, and much of that education has prepared me to represent this tribal community for what was the balance of my life. In 1990, as a result of the renewed interest in Native culture and communities on the heels of the American Indian movement, which took place in the 1970s, we decided that we should start to celebrate our Lenape, ancestry, our Lenape culture, which had really been denied to us for a long, long time. It was actually illegal for us to do ceremony all the way up until 1978 with the passage of the Religious Freedom Act. So, when we Christianized back in the mid-1700s, which we had to divorce ourselves from our culture to do that, to get rid of those savage heathen ways, as the Christians referred to them, we decided to turn the clock back a little bit and celebrate that culture. So we had a reunification effort that began in 1990. We actually went to the state legislature in 1993 to get a state recognition status. And at that time in 1993, we were opposed by the state of Delaware. We were opposed by the University of Delaware. And we were also opposed by the Nanticoke people in Sussex County. So we came away from that effort pretty much deflated. But we continue to meet, and we continue to advocate for our culture. We actually tried to get the SEDATA, the state designated tribal area status that we received in 2010. We tried to get that in 2000. But we were denied access to that as well. When I talked to the state government, they said there's not enough history in our records for us to make that nomination for you. So once again, we came away with our heads hanging low, trying to figure out what we were going to do. And so we decided that for the 2010 census, we would develop our own evidentiary packet. And we did so in 2007, prior to the 2010 census. We provided that packet to the then governor of the state of Delaware, Ruth Ann Minner. And when she actually had served her 2 terms in 2008, new Governor Markell, came into power. And one of the first things he did to his cabinet was to try to get all of the things left on their desk from the Minner administration and resolve them to the best of their ability. So on the Secretary of State's desk was this packet of that we had provided, this evidence. And so when the new SHPO director, the State Historic Preservation Officer, reviewed our packet, he gave me a phone call and he said, Chief Coger, this packet is overwhelmingly convincing. So our first, win came about when I got that phone call. So for the 2010 census, we actually created a census district, and we, for the very first time, were able to, as well as checking a box that said Native American, we could write in our tribal affiliation. So in 2010 as well, we created a constitutional government. Up to that time, we had been governed by a set of bylaws that were associated with our 501c3 that we created back in 1991. But now, in preparation for possibly filing an application for federal recognition, it was necessary for us to create a constitutional government, which is the standard procedure for having a federally recognized tribe. Governor Markell signed that state recognition legislation in 2016. We had a very robust piece of legislation that was signed when I wrote to our legislatures, the local state legislators, asking them to support this effort. I wrote to 2 senators and 2 representatives. I got a response from one. our local representative, who said he'd be happy to help us out. So I sat down with the legislative aides at Legislative Hall and drafted this legislation. And as with all legislation, it starts with, the whereas clauses, whereas this, that, and the other, and, the Lenape have been in the state for X amount of years, and the Lenape have benefited from many programs in the state and all of that history. With the finally the be it resolved area saying the Lenape will be state recognized. So I looked at the legislation, the draft, and I asked the legislator if we could take all of this history that's spelled out in the whereas clauses and put it in the be it resolved areas, because I didn't want it to seem like that we had just fallen out of the sky yesterday, So it was very important that we document that history, which actually was about 125 years long, with all of the whereas clauses that we had identified. And he said, great, we can do that. So we did that. And when I had our legislation reviewed by some attorneys that I had been working with as a member of the National Congress of the American Indian, their comment was, "This is awesome." So we had a very, very robust model for state recognition. And, many of them thought that Delaware would never, ever get to that point. So, that's a little bit of the history of the Lenape, and, where we are as a people today. And I was asked a little bit to talk about some of our Lenape cultural attributes. So I will begin by saying that honoring what is sacred by respecting our relationship with the land and honoring the interconnectedness of all living things is of paramount importance with every Native community. It is true, as you move across the landscape of North America, with every Native community that you encounter, their spirituality emanates from their place. Those relationships with the flora, the fauna, the waters, and even the rocks and stones who have spirit, which in the Lenape worldview gives them life. It is very important that we honor those relationships, as was evidenced by my words before other words that I read as I began this presentation, just acknowledging that, as humans, the world we live in is not an anthropocentric world. Man did not spin the web of life. He is just one strand in that web. And what man does to the web, he actually does to himself. So it's very important when we honor that natural world that we do not put man at the top of that totem pole, because, as I stated, he is just merely one strand in that web of life. And it's interesting, man basically is the only web or only strand of that web that has freedom of choice. And ironically, it is man that has brought much of the destruction that we see that's taken place in the natural world. So I do not believe that man is living up to his original instructions of living in peace and harmony with all living things. A couple of the best practices that can be used to accomplish living in balance is to think of our relatives. And in Lenape, we do not have resources. We have relatives. And the idea is that you would treat a relative much differently than you would treat a resource. So one of the best practices that we live by is to do no harm to any relative. So, whatever you're venturing to do, you've got to be cognizant of the fact that there are other living things that exist in that world, that exist on this land, that exist in that water, that stream. And we should strive to do no harm to any of those relatives. A second best practice for us is to only take what you need. It's and be thankful for everything that you take. In Lenape, in the Lenape world, we have a practice that we call putting down your tobacco. Now, most people would think, well, you want me to put away my cigarettes, or pipe or cigar, but that is absolutely not the case. The tobacco is the most sacred plant that the Lenape grew and cultivated. And the reason that it was so sacred to them is that they used it for prayer. When I say putting down your tobacco, I mean to pray for whatever it is that you might be endeavoring to do. Say you're harvesting a plant. When you identify that plant you want to harvest, the first thing you do is take a pinch of that tobacco and offer it to that plant. You thank it for growing and providing you with sustenance, or if it's a medicinal plant, providing you with the medicine qualities. And then you do not harvest that particular plant because you've probably identified the best looking plant of the group, and you'd move to one of the lesser quality plants and you'd harvest that plant, understanding that perfect plant was next year's plant, next year's crop, the future of that plant, and we want to make sure that that plant stays and lives with us in perpetuity. So putting down your tobacco is an opportunity to pray. As I moved about the native landscape early, I noticed that everybody was giving each other little pouches of tobacco, a little pinch of tobacco wrapped up in a red cloth and kind of tied off with a string. And I wondered about what this practice was all about. But it is one of the most sacred gifts that a person, a Lenape or a native person, could give to a fellow native, because what it represents is actually an opportunity to pray. The Lenape were very thankful. They spent most of their time, you know, in that interconnected relationship with the natural world. So they really had a lot of opportunity to use that tobacco, along with the cedar and the sage, which were used to smudge, to cleanse the body and spirit. Those three plants, the tobacco, the cedar, and sage, were paramount in our spiritual plants. So, what does it take really to demonstrate or to work and try to preserve the natural world on a very local level? I'm a local kind of guy. I believe in local foods. I believe in local citizenship, and developing a healthy citizen, I think, would serve a couple of purposes. First of all, I think a local citizen, a good citizen, should steward by working to restore the health of our water, our air, and our soil. Here in my community, we're engaged in a couple of projects. One is a forest regeneration project, and a second small project that we had. We were gifted a piece of land, about a half an acre, that was in one of the segments of our community, and it had been a dump for, probably 3-4 decades. And we decided after we were gifted this piece of property and it was really the beginning of the land back movement. And we thought that if we were going to receive any land back, that we needed to demonstrate that we could be good stewards of land. So we decided to clean up this property. I pulled 200 tires off the bank of this piece of property that led down to the Fork Branch, was a little stream in the area, and just all kinds of concrete and trash. We had a frame of a car that was down there, and the area had been really taken over by a stand of ailanthus plants. I'm not sure if you know the ailanthus tree, the tree to heaven. It's actually the host tree to the spotted lanternfly. And it is a very invasive plant. And we had a very mature stand of ailanthus on this property as well. And it is one of the most tenacious plants that I've ever encountered in my life. We're still fighting 5 years later, the ailanthus, little seedlings that try to sprout up. But we did a good job. We've got an edible forest garden on that property now, working with the University of Delaware and a few landscape architect interns who have helped us design that edible forest garden. And then 2 years ago, we were gifted an 11-acre piece of property by the Conservation Fund, and it was a Browns field. It came to us with conservation and preservation easements. The property is really polluted to the extent that we can never drill a well on it. But we're working with that piece of property to try to heal it as well. We are removing all of the invasive species on that property, replacing them with native species, and we expect to install some walking paths with other planted guilds. And from my landscape intern friends, I learned that a guild is a planted area of plants that have a symbiotic relationship to each other. They help each other grow. So we're going to transform that, and we're working very diligently to make all of that happen. In 2020, at the ripe old age of 70, I became a National Geographic explorer. Lo and behold, my project that I had submitted was to assess the possibility of reintroducing the freshwater mussel in our watershed. And we had no idea that we would ever find a freshwater mussel, but we were going to look at the water quality and look at the environment of the Lipstick River actually is my local watershed, to see if it was possible to begin that reintroduction. When we got into the stream, and the stream is probably in my area maybe about 4 miles long, we found a healthy, thriving population of freshwater mussels. We were ecstatic that these mussels had survived all of the challenges of agricultural, pesticides and herbicides, and that are really the life's or the death knell for those water species. And we found out that 60% of the world's freshwater mussels are on decline. So it turned out to be a really spectacular project. So that good citizen that I was referring to a little earlier would have an opportunity to look at your local watersheds and see what you can do to make a difference in the health of that watershed. It could be in many cases right there in your backyard. So you don't have to travel too far to do it. So, I also am an advocate of local food production. Um, you know, definitely supporting the local farmers, and for those foods. It's very difficult to find nutrient-dense foods today, especially in our grocery stores. Big ag has pretty much got that market under their control. But I lately began to advocate for a Lenape CSA, a community supported agriculture project. I was invited by Interfaith Delaware a couple of weeks ago to view a documentary called Common Ground. And it was interesting how this documentary, which was based on some studies from the University of Kansas, of how improving your soil, healing your soil, can be as profitable as farming with carbon-based fertilizers. Those microbes or the bacteria, the fungi that should be in your soils, the organic matter that should be in your soils is absent from many of the soils that we're trying to grow crops in today. So to work to in your own local area, if you're growing a vegetable garden, pay close attention to those soils, because they are the secret to having a nutrient-dense vegetable or fruit if you're growing berry plants. Another area that I support is embracing clean energy as a good citizen. We have got to do something to reverse these trends of climate change. Here in Delaware, we're the lowest lying state in the nation, and we will be impacted by sea level rise to a great extent. I mean, they're talking possibly a couple of feet of sea level rise here, by 2075. And, that would be devastating to us. The Lenape have been living with sea level rise for a very long, long time. It wasn't, a couple of thousand years ago, the outer continental shelf was a grassy plain. And the Lenape were out there on that grassy plain. I am aware of an archaeological find. A spear point and a mastodon skull were picked up in a scallop dredge about 40 miles off the coast of Ocean City, Maryland. This spear point, when they did the lithic analysis of it, it was determined that it was mined 200 miles up the Susquehanna River, and that it dated to 23,000 years ago. So there have been people living here in the mid-Atlantic for well in excess of the 12 or 13,000 years that they would have us believe, using the Clovis point as a gauge for occupation. So those people, those 23,000-year-old people, we consider them to be our ancient ones. And of course, there were those that joined us in our home here in the Mid-Atlantic, in this cornucopia of relatives sitting between the Chesapeake Bay and the Delaware Bay. And so we're not denying that we weren't joined by others. But the Lenape, it's interesting about the Lenape, who are considered to be the grandfathers of the Algonquian-speaking peoples. So the Algonquian peoples, that language group existed from the Northeast all the way up to Maine, all the way down to Virginia, along the coast. All of the language that was spoken by those peoples is Algonquian. The Iroquoian people from the state of New York and up into Canada have their own language group, the Iroquoian language, and it actually went around us, and the Cherokee is actually part of the Iroquoian language group. So, but those grandfathers, the Lenape, who were, when you think about the grandfathers of any family, they're usually considered to be the wise ones, and the peacekeepers, the negotiators. Well, that's what the Lenape were for the Algonquian-speaking people. Colonization, when it struck here right in the Mid-Atlantic, was devastating for that whole group of people. So, we certainly are doing well during this month of Native American Heritage Month and remembering those people. The Sicanese are just one small part of the Lenape diaspora. There's only 3 clans that exist amongst the Lenape. You have the Munsee clan, and that word Munsee means people of the rocks and stones. The Munsee people are the northern elevations, northern Jersey, southeastern New York, the upriver sections of the Delaware drainage. As you come down the river, you would encounter the Unami clan. That word Unami means the downriver people. And the people that are associated with Montgomery County would be of the Unami clan. So as you leave the river proper and you enter into the bay, you would encounter the Unalastico clan, and that is the clan that the Sicanese people belong to. That word Unalastico means people next to the big water, and that big water would be the bay and the ocean front. So we've moved quite a bit, covered a lot of territory here in the last 45 minutes or so, and I want to certainly leave some time for questions, Q&A. So I will end my presentation at this time, and I say Wanishi Ta, thank you all, and I'll be happy to answer what questions that you may have.
So thank you so much for that very, very interesting and enlightening presentation. Thank you so much. It not only, I believe, for me, touched my mind and gave me a lot to think about, but also touched my heart. So thank you very much. One of the questions that I believe you just answered was, what is the native language of the Lenape, and is it still spoken today?
Okay, yes. Well, there's a couple of different dialects of the Lenape language. It's my understanding that there were actually 3 at one time, but the Munsee language, the language of the Northern Tier group, is alive and well, and it happens to be spoken more in the Ontario, Canada Lenape. So many of those that left were the Lenape, were the Muncie and the Unami people. There's very little record that I can find in the historical record where the Unalastico really joined those people. I mean, they were so devastated by colonization and that 90% population decline. I don't think many of them went on that trek. So we do have the Muncie dialect, and then we have the Southern Unami dialect. Both of those dialects are very well documented through the work of John Heckewelder and John Zeisberger, who lived amongst the Lenape in the 1740s and the 1750s. They were Moravian missionaries who did an awesome job of documenting both of those dialects of the Lenape language. Now, do we have speakers today? It's rare to find a fluent Lenape speaker of either dialect. There are a couple that exist in Canada who, have been studying that language and teaching it in their schools for probably 20 years now. And there may be some conversational speakers in that group. There may be some conversational speakers amongst the Delawares that reside in Oklahoma. There's 2 federally recognized tribes out there. They may be conversational, but here in the mid-Atlantic, it's very difficult to find anybody. I mean, I say thank you and hello and a few, short prayers. But as far as conversational speakers, that is an aspiration of ours, is to get our people reacquainted with that language since it is so well documented. But it's very difficult when you don't have a practical use for a language to be, conversational with it.
Great. I'm going to ask my colleague Colin to unmute and help me pick out some of the questions that are in the chat. But the one that I see right now in front of me is, are the Lenape peoples involved in any efforts for remunerations from the U.S. government, as with other nations and tribes further west?
We are not in negotiation with the federal government at this time about reparations, I think is kind of what that question is referring to. Sadly, the federal government has a responsibility only to federally recognized tribes. So we don't get an opportunity to engage in conversation with them simply because they have no obligation to talk to us. I do get invitations to consultations. For instance, the Outer Continental Wind Energy Initiative is anytime there's a federal dollar being spent on a project, it has to go through the Section 106 process, where you have to identify any cultural or historical resources that may be impacted by the spending of that dollar. So there's a lot of federal money in the Outer Continental Shelf. So I have been invited to consult on those projects out there. I've consulted on New York's wind energy initiative, New Jersey's wind energy initiative, Delaware's wind energy, Maryland's wind energy, and Virginia's wind energy. When I started doing those consultations, there were no federal tribes to be seen anywhere. They just weren't interested. And except for, there was one exception, the Narragansett of Rhode Island were at the table for those consultations. So, but in the last 5 or 6 years, the federal tribes have really showed up at those consultations. And in many cases, they refuse to continue with a consultation if there's a state recognized tribe in the room. So they're really, moving us to the side, kind of shoving us out of the picture. And, the federal government could really put a stop to that, but it's, that divide and conquer mentality is still very present in the relationship between Indians and the federal government, that's for sure.
Great, thank you. Colin, do you have one more question for us?
Sure. I did flag a couple others that we might not get to, but maybe we can do a follow-up email or so after the session ends. But I think a good one to go out on, Chief Coker, would be how can non-native people best serve as allies?
Great question. In my view, Native people are a very small part of the population. And especially recognized Native communities. The state of Pennsylvania has absolutely no recognized communities. And, for a state that's was a hotbed of Lenape activity, it's inconceivable that there's not a community that exists within the state that can't be state recognized, but there are not. Here in Delaware, we're 0.5% of the population, or even less than 0.5%. So we're very, very small in number. So we need all of the friends that we can get. We need all of the support and advocacy that we can muster on any given issue that we're advocating for. So supporting those Lenape groups with their activities. I do a lot of environmental advocacy. It seems that every environmental group out there, would like to have a Lenape stand, or an Indian for any matter, of any group standing next to them on stage, because it just seems like, we the Lenape, whose original instructions were to be caretakers of the environment, would be at that table, the environmental table. So supporting those groups. And I will say, if you're a member of an organization, or you have a group that you meet with regularly, developing a land acknowledgement statement is a good place to start as well. The land back movement was the precursor to the land acknowledgement statement, but it was quickly learned that if you were going to return land, which, I'm not saying that a land back movement has to be the return of land, but you need to find out who that land belonged to. Who are the original people that were living on the land that you now live, work, and worship on? And have that story, create that, or that narrative, and just pay homage to those people, past, present, and future. So support. If they're up in your neck of the woods, it's very difficult to find a Native organization. So it's hard to support in that manner. But if you can support in any way, I know we get donations a lot from different entities, a lot of environmental groups, a lot of senior citizen facilities. We do presentations, we do as much as we possibly can. And now and then you find a donor who will, donate something substantial. In our case, we had a donor, and we created a scholarship fund with a donor. We actually matched the donor's donation, and this is our first year for having a scholarship fund for our high school students to consider, college level classes. So support, I would say, is the best thing that you could do to help us out.
Well, we are out of time, but we certainly appreciate all of our participants, everybody that was able to attend today. Thank you, Colin, for your support. And Chief Dennis Coker, we really sincerely thank you for your time. And we hope that you'll join us again.
Thank you, and I'll be happy. I'll be happy to join again. Native American Heritage Month for me is every month, so thank you so much for the invitation.
Well, everyone have a wonderful afternoon. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye.
Bye.